I'm Don Kincaid, this is Karen Elfner, and we also have a co-presenter exemplar from Marana Unified School District in Arizona, but their school climate transformation grant ran out of funds and they couldn't make it to the training. The grant was over, but they did give us content to share, so we will be doing that. So we welcome you here to talk about person-centered planning and how it can help make better outcomes. Support better outcomes within your school. In fact, there's about 20 more people here than we expected to have a presentation on person-centered planning. But I'm glad you're here to learn. How many of you have done person-centered planning? Great. Any experiences and ideas that you want to share with us would be certainly welcome. I've been doing it for about 30 years. You've probably been doing it about the same length of time. And we'll talk about some of our experiences with that, why it's so important, and how it's kind of, one of the reasons we wanted to put this in the agenda is it's kind of a lost art. It's something that we need to go make sure we're embedding in intensive supports for students with a very challenging behavior. We want to make sure that we're not just delivering interventions, but we're also looking at how we can address the context of that student's life and produce outcomes that go beyond just behavior change to how do you develop friendships, get a job, live independently, have a satisfying relationships in a life. All those things can be achieved through utilizing a person-centered planning approach. We're going to first talk about what person-centered planning is and what it's not, and the rationale for person-centered planning, when to use it, when you don't really use it. We'll talk about multiple kinds of processes we've used and seen used across the years. And we'll talk about an example of one pilot or one example of that you can take a look at. We'll also share some other examples and some from our history of things we've done that worked. So person-centered planning is a way for diverse people to come together with a common need and a common goal and to develop a vision, a purpose, and a goal. Now around an individual student, it's about what's the vision for that student, what's their goal, what do they want to see happen. For an agency, person-centered planning is also in a way of an agency developing a real clear vision, a goal, and a set of activities to change what they do. So it's not just at an individual student level or child level or family level, it can also be used at a large organizational level. And it's really, at that student level, it's how to really understand who is that student. What's their past? What are the issues they're facing now, and where do they want to go? What are their goals for the future, and how do we help them get those? And it's how do we come together as a group to come up with real ideas for change. It's action planning, but fun action planning is the way you can think about it. It's a way to also how do you mutually support each other in that process? Realizing that a student that you might do person-centered planning with is not a situation that situation is not going to be addressed in a week. Okay? You may be engaged with that student for multiple years, and they may need ongoing support for their entire life. Okay, so it's building that community of support, how to support each other, how to support families and schools and communities, and how to develop that team and how to learn from each other. Because it's not just about the student changing and growing, it's about every member of the team changing and growing to make person-centered planning work. A couple of things that person-centered planning is not. It's not an easy one-shot process. It's not an activity you do and you're done. Okay? It's a jumping off point to begin to understand that student or understand that agency and to begin long-term planning and commitment to that process. It's not going to answer every problem, fix every issue that you're going to, but it will probably identify a lot of them that need to be addressed. Okay. You're going to be addressing issues, well, you know, Johnny's got a problem behavior, we could develop a traditional behavior intervention plan, but you know, are we paying attention to Johnny's homelessness? Are we paying attention to his family's opioid use? Are we paying attention to the high poverty crime? Are we talking about mental health issues, behavioral issues, medical issues, diet? All of those kind of things that we need to begin addressing in that person-centered planning process. And it's not a quick solution. You're not going to change your organization agency and change a person's life in one 3-hour meeting. Okay? It's also not something that said we did person-centered planning and then we did something else. Person-centered planning is that process of doing all those things together. It's also not a guarantee of success. You've got a lot of things to work on. Doing person-centered plan doesn't always result in everything you want it to. We've had failures with supporting people. We've had tremendous successes. But it lays the foundation as we talk about what person-centered planning is. But it serves a lot of different purposes. One of those, person-centered planning, is of course a planning process. It's a way of coming up with structured action planning process, but helping a team get to that, to understand what it is they should be doing. Not just, well, let's come up with action plans. We're going to come up with understand that person's life, and we're going to come up with better plans. It's an assessment tool. You're understanding the context. One of my colleagues from years ago, Ted Carr, always did functional behavior assessments and behavior support plans. He's started the Association for Positive Behavior Support. He's kind of the father of it. And Ted did all kinds of communication approaches and all kinds of behavioral support approaches and kind of built PBIS and started that process. And he'd never done person-centered planning. And I always talked to him about it. He said, then he stopped me one day and he said, Don, we started doing person-centered planning. He said, I will never do functional assessment and behavior support at Tier 3 without doing person-centered planning again. He said, what it did is I really got to understand who that student, who that child, who that adult was. What were the issues in their life from their past to where they're at now, all the context of variables that you need to know if you're going to come up with really good support for that student. You need to know about this. And also what that student or that adult wanted to achieve. What were their goals for the future? Not what are mine as a clinician or what are mine as the mother or father of a child, but what's that student want? It is sometimes an intervention on its own. Those of you that have done person-centered planning can probably attest that when you got into that process, something changed about the team and the support for that student, even as you went through the process. Because sometimes you begin to understand why a student was doing something or things that had happened in their life, and the teacher goes, oh my gosh, I just now got it. I just now saw what was going on, and I know what I need to do to help support this student better. It's also very motivational. It builds the team. It results in a team that's not just about that student. It's about a community of support because it's going to go beyond that classroom. Person-centered planning is intended to go beyond the classroom, to the home, to the community, wherever that student may be going. It's also a team building process. That team is going to commit to years. One of the teams I did many years ago, one of the frames is we talk about fears of the family for a young child. And the family said, they looked at the history and the family said, my fear is you're not going to be here in 2 weeks because no one else has lasted more than a couple of weeks with us. Okay. Well, what happened is the team said, it's not going to happen anymore. It's not going to happen anymore. I was sharing this with some of my staff the other day, and I remembered many years ago we started this team for that student with a young student about 3 years old in preschool and had a diagnosis of autism. He just graduated from the university with a 3.8 grade point average. This was early childhood setting, trying to get rid of him, saying he can't come, we can't manage his behavior. But person-centered planning laid the foundation. So I got that announcement in the mail. It was one of those things, oh, this is what it's worth. This is what it's all about. And the mom put a little note and said, if we hadn't done this 20 years ago, we wouldn't be here today. So let's talk about the person-centered planning 5 essential goals. One of those is the student, individual should be present and participating in community life. That's kind of a foundational principle. It's not about how can we develop a more restrictive special education setting for that student. Okay, it's how does that student engage in everything, every opportunity, everything else every other student has. How do they gain and maintain satisfying relationships? One of the things that comes up in this is people say, I want to just have a friend. You have a parent that will say, here's something I want. I would like for someone to call my son or daughter and just ask to come over for a play date. It's never happened before. Okay. We want the same thing. We want to be able to go have that kind of relationships, friends for my son or daughter. We also want them to make choices. We want them to have the same choices that other students. What big, small things like what to wear, but also what they're going to do with their life and what they want to do after school and where they want to go. They have to have fulfilling roles and to live with dignity. So what that means is we really want people to begin to identify who they are. I asked Karen, I won't ask her again. But when somebody asks you who you are, you're going to say, I'm Don Kincaid. I'm a professor. I am also a member of this church, or I'm a papa for a grandson and hopefully a good husband. My wife might disagree, but hopefully a good husband. But all those things I'd use to describe myself are the respected roles that I have in my life. And we see many people with disabilities, many people with very challenging behaviors, they haven't developed those. They've not been given an opportunity to do that. And we want to have that happen. And the last one is to develop personal competencies. What we mean by that is everybody continues to learn to grow. Not just the person with problem behaviors, but everybody on the team learns to grow. We think it's important to reframe and go back to person-centered planning for those most challenging students because it retains and makes sure you're focusing on that student's needs and not just about what the agency wants. I tell the story of years ago, one of the teams that the agency was talking about how they were committed to supporting the student to transition from an institution, and they had developed an 8-person group home, and he would go into it, and they were very excited about it because it was very person-centered, and the individual, somebody very savvy colleague of the friend of the individual that was moving from the institution had programmed his communication device to say, I want to live on this street with this person in this city. And he hit that 50, 60 times during the meeting. Okay? And finally, we had to stop the meeting and said, guys, your agency's saying this is what you're going to do. He's telling you this is what he wants. It's going to change. It's not about what you want to provide. It's about what he wants in his life. It supports a team approach. It's not about an expert deciding what's important for that student's life. It broadens what you're doing. It's not about changing and decreasing problem behavior. It's about how do we get this person a high quality of life. All the things that they want to see, friends, where they live, a job, fun things to do, going out in the community, all of those things that are important. It fundamentally can change the participants. One of the stories I share is years ago I was called into a very heated situation and asked to do person-centered planning and PBIS, and it was a student that was about 14. His family was here, the school system was here, the community agency supporting them was over here, and no one was talking to each other. In fact, school personnel were told they weren't even allowed to talk to the mother in any way. And they began sharing, and one of the frames we'll talk about is one where it's called respect. What does the person do to gain respect, and what are some things they do to lose respect? And it's a very difficult frame, but it's one that's very open about what's going on. And the agency started sharing, we really like John. He's funny, he does this, he's very helpful, he's great at electronic things, he really loves this. And he's sharing this, and the mother, who was a very, very challenging person, she was tough, but she had 3 children with autism. She was a tough person because of the environment that had been created. She was surviving. She was swimming against the tide. It was difficult. She started to cry, and she said, my son is 14 years old. This is the first time we've had a meeting where you told me you like him. You told me something positive about my son. Every time we've ever got together before was, he's done something wrong, and we need to do something about it. He said, we're changed now. I can work with you because we're seeing the same child, the same student. We're on the same page. And what that does is going to result in supports that better fit that person's life. That's why it's so important. So what person-centered planning is a series of frames and activities that you engage in to help you work together it's a visual representation. We'll share a few of those, but we're going to show mostly outlines of what the process looks instead of specific ones, every single kind that we can show. But it's based upon the idea that you're bringing together a group of individuals that know that person well, they're desired by the person, and we sometimes call a stakeholder because they're stakeholders in that person's life. They care. Okay, so it's not just the teacher. It could be the family, it could be the minister, it could be the chief of police, it could be anybody that really wants to have a role in that, and the family and the student also makes that determination. Okay. I've done person-centered planning in the past where the team that came together wasn't the team that was there at the end of the meeting. Okay? The team that I did one for a girl who brought her boyfriend, and halfway through the meeting she said, you know, these are the goals I want and you're not going to help me get those. Goodbye. Broke up with a guy right in the middle of the meeting. Very, very stressful, but this actually was a good, and everybody's going, oh, thank God. We were hoping that would happen, but she finally saw that in this meeting. So a person-centered planning team really commits to change and builds support around that individual. It's not about supporting a system. It's not about what do we do to support this student in the setting we have or the supports we have. It's how do we identify what supports that student needs, and we come up with those. And that means that we may come up with things that are not traditional within our educational system. They're not going to be a placement. It may be support within a general education setting or in the community or using different individuals, and really understanding how we can have individuals contribute to that person's life. So here are some examples of the history, and we'll talk about a few of these from individual service design, personal futures planning, maps and circles, essential lifestyle planning. And there's another one, and path. There's also talk about, the example we have is renew, right? Yeah, I think there's a renew one that will be an example that we have. And we'll also share with you one that we've kind of done to take all of these together into a process we use with a team. So these are a sample, and some of the ones we'll talk about real briefly today. So making action plans, you're on for that one.
Okay, so making action plans is our first example of a person-centered planning process that we're going to share with you. I won't be able to show you the video because I couldn't connect to the internet, but there actually are some really neat videos illustrating the processes that we go over today. So if you just kind of do a YouTube search, you can see examples of the process in action, and really the process in action is the key. And you'll see from some of the illustrations what I mean when I say that really the process is the key. So this is the MAPS, kind of the schema for MAPS. Each of the different processes has different, what we refer to as frames or elements, and they go in steps. And so this particular process starts with the story. And the story here is kind of the person, the individual, the target person's story, kind of their history, where they have been and what has happened in their life that brought them to this point in time. So it's kind of a snapshot, a little narrative about what brought them to today. And then the next step is the dream, and you'll see this is some of these are common elements of all processes that we'll go through, but dream is always one, because dreaming is a critical element to finding what they want to achieve and where they want to go. And dreaming is also something that most of the individuals that we work with don't do very much of, right? So a lot of the time that we're focused on working with these individuals, we're identifying or talking about the problems that we're experiencing and how do we eliminate those problems, and the idea of actually focusing or thinking about what we ideally would like in a perfect situation is just not something we usually take the time to do. So the dream, and then in this particular, what's unique to this process is actually identifying the nightmare, and the creator of MAPS, or the co-creator, Marcia Forrest, really felt like this was an important piece, that to put kind of the elephant in the room on the table, to say, I am really concerned that this might happen, and I need to say it and put it out there, and then move on. So we've identified our dream, but we need to acknowledge what our worst nightmare is, and then move on to, okay, what do we have now? Who are the people and the resources, the things that could contribute, or that we have that we know now that could help us in reaching our dreams? And then what will it take? So then it's really starting to think about where are the gaps between what we have now and our dreams, and what kinds of things would need to be accomplished, who would we need to involve, what kinds of things would it take in order to achieve that dream given where we are. And then this is the actual agreements, this is your action plan, who's going to do what when. So this is a pretty, it's kind of one of the more simplistic kinds of planning processes, but can definitely work well. And these little areas here, this is for the people who participated. So your team, very important members, and they kind of get to sign. It's an important part or feature of the process of doing planning is everybody sort of signs on to the plan. And then this is an opportunity for a little reaction. So how did you feel about the process? And here's a little illustration. So you'll see another really critical piece of most of these planning processes is the illustrative feature. In most cases, you have a facilitator, and that would be the person who's kind of the talking through the process, making sure everybody's participating, engaging. And then you have the recorder, and that's someone who has some artistic abilities maybe, and can graphically illustrate what's going on. But the idea here is that you go beyond just kind of taking the literal word notes down, but to try to bring out some of the emotion of what you're trying to communicate through the plan. You think about what a picture paints 1,000 words, so you're really trying to capture some of the emotion of what's behind the goal. So when you go through this process and you learn to be a facilitator, usually they want you to experience the process for yourself. So like I went through doing a path planning, this individual went through a MAPS planning. So this is his map, and his goal was to be on stage as a performer, and his nightmare was to lose an arm, to be a one-armed man, because then he couldn't perform. So anyway, so this is just a little idea. You see how they tend to be very colorful, they tend to be, and depending on who your audience is, sometimes it's very critical. If you think you have an individual who is not literate, who doesn't read, then it's really important to have the visuals, because if you're trying to communicate what they're telling you about their history or about their dreams, you have to capture it sort of in visuals in order to make sure that you're getting down on the graphics what their intentions are. Okay, personal profile frames.
So like one of the things that was shared on the maps was the end result was the action planning process. But what we normally tend to do is we problem solve and start with action planning. What's the problem? How do we problem solve that action plan? This is about gathering the information so that the action plan becomes much more organic and more natural, and it matches the needs of that student much better. So personal profile is a process we've used many times, and we'll share some ways we've adapted it in Florida. But the personal profile frames are things like, here are some sample ones, like who is here, who's important to me, relationships. You can go back to some of the things we talked about before that person-centered planning is supposed to identify. Relationships, who are the people? Where do I go? Being present and participating. What's my history? What's my life story? What's my current health, my routines, the choices? What gains respect from me? What loses respect from me? What works? What needs to be changed? Those are some common personal profile frames. And as you go through this process, I'll share with that as I've done this in the past, I've probably done 100 of these. And I've never once had an individual that was the focus of this, or the family that was the focus of this, say they didn't want to participate. Not one time. I've had one person that said he didn't want to, but we arranged it such that he was going to be in the area that the presentation was occurring. And we said, we're going to go through this, John, on our own, but you come on in whenever you feel if you want to. So he would come by and look in the door. He'd walk past it all the time. He was there, and within an hour, he was in drawing the frames himself. Why? Because the process is not like traditional team meetings, where sometimes bad things happen to people. This is about where good things happen to you, or with you, and to support you. Some additional frames, again, what are the major themes? So when we go through this process and gather all this, we want the team to see what are the big pieces of information that you drew from this. Well, I really saw they didn't have any friends. Or here's my problem is I don't get to go anywhere. Or I don't get to make any choices in my life. Someone's telling me what to do all day long, every day, even from what I wear to what I eat to what I do. Those are big themes that we want to gather the information about. And so we can then begin to plan some more, what do we need to do to support, and we can develop and move into short-term goals for supporting that person. And am I doing futures planning? Can't remember. Futures planning is, here's an example. Yes, you got a question? Yes.
Yeah, just back up because I'm not familiar with that last one that you just covered. So on each of these frames, like do you put them on a chart pack or something like that?
Yes.
And then you just go through and you answer those. You don't necessarily do all of those.
No, those are some common frames. What you want to do is you're going to want to try to identify which ones are probably going to be most critical for that person. And in the middle of the meeting, if you realize, oh, we've got a lot of health issues here we have not addressed, let's make sure we get those addressed. Or we want to go more into depth on the relationships piece and talk about friendships. Or any of those kind of things, you can do that. These are common frames that could be used. Some of them will say, here are the 8 you use. But we think there are other frames that you might need to pull in every now and then. As you become adept at doing that person-centered planning process, and we'll show you an example of how we pulled together 3 or 4 different processes to do what we do in Florida. Okay? So in futures planning, you're moving from personal profiles to what's the plan, what does that person want to see happen in their life? And that's where futures planning occurs. So for Dustin, here are some of the things that the team wanted to see it happen at home, some things they wanted to see happen at school. So here's an example. He was not included in general education. Dustin attended regular ed classes with peers. Inclusion was a big, big thing. And community, just be able to go to the movies, join the Boy Scouts, go to T-ball. We're talking about access to the same thing everybody else has that he's not had because of his behavior, because of disabilities, because of anything else in the community that might be impacting that. Again, we're not talking about having a futures plan that is out of reach for that person. You know, sometimes people say, well, what if the person's asking for something that's just not possible? Yeah, that happens. Well, I've had a person that says, I want to be a truck driver. He had the skills to be a truck driver, but he'd been arrested for stealing 5 or 6 trucks. And so that was a problem. But when we began to look at it, we began to see, you know, there are aspects of that we can drill down into and understand. You know, I share with folks, I want to be a point guard for the Lakers. Okay? I've always wanted to be, I still want to be. I don't think it's going to happen. This is probably my best year to have that happen because they don't have one. But it's not likely to happen. But I can still play basketball with my friends. I can still go out and shoot. I can have some Laker colleagues that we can talk about the games with. All those things are still part of what that dream could be. Same with him. We've drilled down into it and realized he didn't need to want to drive a truck. He wanted to hang out at truck stops. He liked truckers. He liked truck stops. He wanted to work at a truck stop. There we go. There is a vocational goal for that guy. Stealing trucks was one way to get to the truck stop. Okay? Yes?
The question I noticed on your futures plan, it's not just for the client, Dustin, also for family members
Yes.
as well.
Yep.
Is that always the case?
No, it's not always the case. Sometimes it's only the family. Sometimes it's both. Sometimes it's the student. And sometimes it's that transition piece. We've had situations where there was that tension there of, I'm 16 years old, I want to start making my own decisions, and my mom still wants to do this for me. Those issues come up within this process. So those are always where you're focusing. Another example for this student, this is a student that had very, very severe problem behaviors. The teacher was beat to death nearly every day, scratches, bruises all over him, black eyes. And we came down to do the person-centered planning process and began to emerge all the issues we need to address to support that student with dual sensory impairment issues and very few communication. Those of you the good PBIS folks realize he was communicating just fine. Unfortunately, he only had one way to communicate, and they weren't teaching appropriate communication skills. For this guy, they were teaching him to identify barnyard animals. Very powerful. So if he encountered a chicken or a goat or a pig, he was socially competent. But he couldn't say stop, help, food, water, bathroom, anything he needed to communicate. So he engaged in challenging behaviors. But there were other things that occurred is wanting to identify things at home. How do we address leisure activities and independence? And this is where, as they went through the process, you know, there was this very interesting dynamic with the family, and the mom, you know, the school said, you know, we think she might be an opioid abuser because she falls asleep in meetings. She's just not there. She doesn't show up half the time. And they developed this history that wasn't true. As they began this process, they began to realize that he slept 1 hour a night. And she worked 2 jobs and was up with him all night long every night because he had very challenging behaviors. She couldn't leave him alone. She never got to sleep. And so you can imagine what you're going to be like if you work 2 jobs, never got to sleep, and you're called into a meeting at school. Okay? And they begin to realize, oh my God, you know, we didn't realize what this is like. Begins to build that team, begins to build a commitment to that family. Okay, nothing's working now. Hold on. There we go.
Take you off again. Okay, so this is a path and planning alternative tomorrows with hope. And this process, just another style of futures planning using graphic techniques. This one, I think, is one that I've used the most with both individuals and organizations. We use it a lot in our project, and we use it also with our school and district teams for doing planning. So we've found it to be very useful for going both for individual futures planning as well as organizational planning. But this is their frame. So again, we're starting here with the dream, and they call it the North Star dream. So that's what the star is there. And as usual, the dreaming is the most difficult part. And depending on even your organization, sometimes those dreams can be difficult. So it's really the importance to have a good facilitator for helping people get that dream. In this particular process, you go from the dream where you're, of course, thinking if all things were possible in a perfect world, you had all the money and all the resources and anything goes, what would you want? And then you just would fill up as much white space as you can on your chart with all the possible thoughts and ideas you have for your dreams. And then you would think, okay, so those are my dreams. So what are some of the goals? What are some of the concrete goals? What would that look like? And usually when we would do the goals, we would think you might come up with 3-year goals, but that's variable depending on what you're doing, how far out you want your goals to be. But those are things that could actually be more concrete, achievable. But once you've been able to dream first, it makes it more possible to come up with a goal that goes beyond just eliminating a problem behavior, or some of those more common things that we find ourselves going through the cycle in. And if you can't imagine something as being possible, then there's no way you're ever going to be able to plan for it or do it. So the dreaming is really critical to reach goals that go outside of the norm of where we've been. So then you establish your goals for, say, 3 years, and then after you establish some goals, then you go back here and you say, okay, so where are we now? What's the current state of affairs? What's our current functioning? What are our current resources? And then who do we need to enroll? All right, so if we're going to reach this goal that we have, who do we need to get on board? What do we need to build strength in? So what do we need to learn? What do we need to be able to do? How are we going to get those resources or skills to be able to make our goal happen? And then we work backwards from our goal. So, you know, it's too much to have just a long-term goal and then go, oh, you get out 3 years and go, well, we didn't make that goal. So we break this down into incremental. So back from our goal, what would that look like in 6 months from now? Where should we be if we're going to meet that goal of out 1 year or 3 years? And then what would we do in 1 month? What would we have done in 1 month if we want to reach the 6 month and then the 1 or 3 year goal? So it really does work well in terms of getting you moving. And I think that's one of the reasons that we've found it works both for individual but also organizations. It really does get you moving along. But here's an example of now you can read all of that, right? Sometimes it's even hard to see what the illustrations are, but this is a very simplistic illustration of a path, but you get the idea again. So she's not going to be cranky in the future. Their family's going to have a lot of road trips. She's going to be able to order at McDonald's. That was one of their goals. Their child would be able to order at McDonald's. And then, you know, now, well, she's cranky and tired and she yells, but she can be fun and cuddle, right? So these are the people that are going to be involved, some families. They're going to involve good luck, which I like that idea, you know. Can't hurt. So they're going to use the tech talk. They're going to use the touch. They're going to get stronger. They're going to do math. So then they have their first steps. So she's going to, in 6 months, they're going to be at 4-H in the state fair, right? By 2 months, see, you can adjust the time frame to what meets your needs. She's going to have her first sleepover in 2 months, see? And the first step, she's going to have an art award. So you see, you can personalize the timeline and you can make these things personalized in terms of what's important and functional for your goal. Right. So Dawn's going to share how we integrated the planning process.
And again, this is looking at how we took some of the best features of all of these to really develop what we wanted to do in Florida. So what we did was to kind of combine the path and the personal profile and the futures planning process. And we moved to the idea of, again, the dreams out there. We start from the dream to, in this case, we actually don't do the goals right away. We go back here and we actually would write, starting here, as things like, how are you feeling right now? What are your feelings? And we address many of these different areas, from people, places, health, history, choices, respect, strategies, hopes and fears, barriers and opportunities, the themes from all of those. And then we just have a simple, what are our big goals? How do we take a first step back? So we adapted a little bit, but these frames were very helpful to us to begin to understand. A couple of them I'll point out very importantly. People one is laid out in such a way that you have the individual in the middle, and you put the people who are closest to the person towards the middle. And what we normally see in that frame is, it would jump out as a theme usually, is she doesn't have any friends. She's, or the only people that are in her life are paid agency personnel. Okay? Or everything's being done by her family, but there's nobody else involved. Or they don't get to go any place in the community because of issues that are happening. We see tons of traumatic things within history that will, the team will aha. They'll be amazed by what they didn't know about that person. One of the individuals, a young child I worked with, was the entire school called her the biter. That she didn't even have a name. She was just known as the biter. And what happened they didn't know much about her history. She was in foster care, but they knew that when they would reach over her shoulder in class, she would clamp onto their arm and bite. And then they'd have to call for somebody to come and grab her, usually a big SRO person from the school. He would take her to a room, and she'd go out of control, and he'd have to spend the entire day restraining her. Okay? When they do the history piece, they begin to realize, first thing they realized was under health, she had a hearing deficit they didn't know about. So imagine that you couldn't hear and someone just comes over your shoulder. Then she'd had a very long history of sexual abuse. And so now you're into the trauma. Those of you that are understanding the impact of trauma and how she's just totally unable to manage her behavior because it's uncontrollable because it's the trauma. Now you add in to the response to that is to call the big burly guy to grab her and put her in a closet. Every day the trauma was being reenacted into what would happen in her history. And the school began to finally realize, oh my God, we're making this worse. We're reenacting every day the trauma of her life. We've got to get out of that. And they began to change what they were doing. We've had other situations where they've identified respect or choices or strategies. And so you begin to see some critical things that begin to impact your team to say, we can change what we're going to do to support this person better. Sometimes it's emotional. We get it. We're upset that we missed this before. Sometimes it's just, now that I understand this, we can come up with a better set of strategies and supports for that student. Do you want to take this part or you want me to? So here's, again, just an example of ways we've done this from our team. These are some of our folks. You've got leadership and a facilitator. Normally, it's somebody drawing and somebody else facilitating. I'm terrible at the drawing piece of it. My writing is inside, you can't even read it. But I use a lot more words than pictures. Other people can use pictures very well. But I normally combine those two. Someone with some skills at the art piece is great. And having a team there, having different representatives and different folks that are there that can impact the outcomes for that individual. Having people present who know and love the person the best, and then are in there, and that person's approved of them being there. My example, years ago when I was in West Virginia, we were closing down all the state institutions, and we used person-centered planning to move people into the community. We closed them all down. People lived in the community because this process worked so well. But one of the things we learned in that process is the strongest advocate of keeping the institution open was one guy whose daughter had lived there since she was born. She was 30 years old. Their family went through this process, and she saw the frame that was about relationships, and she saw that her daughter did not have one single friend. Okay? She had staff, and she had some family, but no friends. And for her, that broke her heart, and she said, 30 years ago I was told this is what I was supposed to do with my daughter. And that's not what we should have done. And we want to see her live in the community near us, and and they did. And 5 years after that, he was running Home of Your Own program, where he was finding hundreds of people with disabilities that had left institutions, homes in West Virginia, because he got it. So not only did it impact her, but it impacted the whole family and impacted the whole system. As Karen says, we've done this work with entire agencies that say we want to change the way we work. We don't want to run a group home. We don't want to run day programs. We don't want to run segregated special education settings. We want to change our way of work. And they use a person-centered planning process and path process to do that. And it's a team of individuals who help you reach your dreams. Graphics, utilizing those. Food's always a good one. Do this. This process can take anywhere from a couple of hours to 3 or 4 or 5 hours. Usually it's about 3 hours. But it's skilled at doing the process and preparing people for the process. It's not that difficult. Sometimes you can do an hour here, an hour there, an hour there. Do them in a restaurant, do it at somebody's house. It doesn't have to be in an agency or in a classroom. Do it wherever that person's most comfortable. Here are just some examples of testimonials. Person-centered planning is about believing in someone. You come out with a better understanding of what the person wants, how you can help them get it, and then believing that they can achieve it. You're focused on the behaviors and the limits of the ability to make the person's needs a priority. That's what person-centered planning gets you away from just addressing behavior. Okay? So we're going to talk about another example of the renew process. Hang it.
Okay, so I'm going to change my hat here and be Melissa Hall. So she was unable to join us today, but she shared with us what they've been doing in Marana School District, which is just north of Tucson in Arizona. And they've done a lot of work, and we definitely want to honor and share some of what they've accomplished. So this is a little information about their school district. They had the School Climate Transformation Grant, but as Dawn indicated, their grant is over and they had no more funds, so she couldn't come. But I'm going to talk some about what they did through that grant, and fortunately their district has been able to maintain some of the practices and some of the staff, including Melissa, who was the SCT coordinator, and now she's an MTSS coordinator. So they kept some of the staff and a lot of the same practices. So that's really nice to hear that people didn't just do a grant for the 5 years and then let it all die when the grant was over. So they've maintained some of the practices. So they have about 17 schools, a little less than 13,000 students. Their students are primarily white and Hispanic. Little bit of information about their students, about almost 40% on free and reduced lunch. And there's their graduation rate, which was something she wanted to share. So you get a little picture about who their population is. And I know that you can't see this in detail, but what this really illustrates is the interventions that their district has at Tier 2 and Tier 3. And across the bottom, this indicates the number of unique students that are receiving each of these kinds of interventions. So they are really committed to providing more intensive levels of intervention and tracking who's receiving these interventions, which for me at a systems level is really great, because that's a real struggle to get people to really manage who's receiving which types of interventions, which is the first step to then being able to say, is that intervention happening with fidelity, and then is it really making a difference for that individual? So they really have been committed, and they did this through their School Climate Transformation Grant. So this is a little easier to read. These are some of the interventions that they had in place. Every school had these available. Not every school opted to use these interventions. Renew is the one that we're focusing on, the planning process they used with Renew. And that's primarily done with older students, usually in the high school. They did a couple in a middle school, but primarily in the high schools. They also employed a lot of resources at the district level to support those programs, those interventions that they had for students that needed more intensive supports. So it's really, I think, a testament to, they didn't just do school level interventions, they really developed a lot of district level supports in order to make sure that the schools and the individual students really had success. The other thing the district had is commitment. So they actually made these 5 areas that they committed as a district, and they're all really important, right? And it's nice to see that they're a committed district to all of these things. And we're going to see how these commitments really play out in the Renew process. particularly strong relationships, really a key, and the engaging learners for deeper learning. So keeping students engaged is really one of the priorities and the purposes of the Renew process. So when you think back to that slide that had all of the interventions that they have available at MUSD, you can have a lot of interventions, but if you can't engage your students in those interventions, they're not going to be very effective, right? And so how do you build engagement? And their philosophy is that it's through building relationships. And if we can really build the relationships with our students, then we can engage them better in the interventions, in the school, and then we can be more effective. So I'm going to ask a question. How do you build relationships? So when you're building a relationship, how do you do that? What does that look like? That's not rhetorical. Yeah.
Getting on their level, taking time to communicate.
Take time.
With them, say good morning. Those check-in and check-outs are amazing.
Communicating regularly. Yeah. What else do you do when you want to build a positive relationship with someone?
Ask questions.
Ask questions.
Authentic caring.
Be caring.
They know when you're being
Authentic.
They know.
Mm-hmm.
Be your word.
Be your word. So you got to be trustworthy, right?
Share parts of yourself.
Share something about yourself, right? You really be a little vulnerable yourself, right? So, yes, so this is what they communicate and believe in their district, that these are the things that are important. So you see, you guys identified some of those: being genuine, establishing some trust, being relatable and honest. So this is how you build relationships, right? These are important things. And you build relationships with students the same way you build relationships with adults. They're people, right? So we also know that relationships take time, right? You're not going to build a relationship in 5 minutes. It's just not an instantaneous sort of thing. So it takes effort and intention to build a relationship, right? What happens if you have a relationship and then you don't spend any time or focus on it, right? It loses something, right? Relationships take time and intention, and that's true with our students too. So if we don't have a focus and intention on those relationships, we're not going to build them. And so you take the time to get to know a student and understand their goals and barriers, and that was important in this school district. So now you know some strategies, right, for how to understand people's goals and barriers. We've introduced you, at least briefly, to a bunch of strategies, and you can learn further about how to facilitate and use those. But some of those tools will be great for helping you to get to know your students. But it's going to take some time. But it's important. So here's a nice little quote from one of their counselors. So the other thing to think about is, and we talked a little bit, people said, how do you get to know someone? Right? So how a relationship builds is one thing, but think about how you get to know someone. So my idea is, think back to maybe when you were still in the dating, or maybe you are in the dating world, and you maybe saw someone and you thought, they're kind of interesting, maybe I want to get to know them. So what do? I mean, what is speed dating? You sit there and you ask questions, and you ask questions, and they ask you questions, and you ask questions. Or maybe you go on Facebook and you learn about them, and you find out, it's your friend's brother's friend, and you say, well, tell me about so-and-so. So you go to somebody who knows them and you ask them questions about the person. Well, that's what we're doing here. right? So that's what we're asking you to do. We ask the student, right? We interview the student, we talk to the student, we get to know the student. Maybe we talk to their teachers, we talk to their friends, we talk to their family members. This is how you get to know somebody. It's the same way you get to know anybody in your life, right? Just think about it in that way. There are some other things that we can use, like interest inventories, and I think I have an example. Here's one. This is an example that they used in this district. It's a forced choice inventory for reinforcers. Sometimes for some students, it's hard to answer an open-ended, like, what do you like, or what are you interested in, and that sort of an open-ended interview kind of, it's difficult for them to clarify or come up with it. So these kinds of tools can be helpful in those scenarios. And you know, choices are hard, and a choice from a big long menu of things, like which of these 52 things do you like, check all the 52 things you like. Well then, how do you even know which is priority, which things they... So these kinds of forced choice surveys can be really nice because you'll see they repeat. So here they've got the bag of chips with the classmates ask you to be on a team, and then classmates, so maybe you like classmates asking you more than a bag of chips, but maybe you don't like classmates ask you to be on the team more than being the first to finish your work, right? So you can start to, through these kinds of inventories, you can really understand maybe a little more about the priorities of an individual.
Where do you find examples of these kind of forced?
That actually has a link to the survey in this. And I think if you just Googled that term exactly, you would get it. So the mapping process they use for Renew has these elements. So as we went through, what is our timing? How much time do we have left? Okay. As we went through our examples of the different person-centered planning processes, you see they use a lot of the same ideas. They do a history. Histories are great. One tip for when you do a history, because people could get really involved in their history and it could take a long time. So one strategy is to be in 2 to 3 minutes, give us your history. So you give them a time frame. Another is, and one of the frames that we use, it gives blocks. So there'll be like 6 squares that you fill in. So it forces you to think of what are the 6 most critical points in your history. So things like that can help to kind of frame it up a little bit so that people don't go down rabbit trails in talking about your history. And then who are you today? A little bit about, so that you get from their perspective who they are and what's important that they see about them as an individual. Strengths and accomplishments. What have they done? What do they feel like are their most powerful traits and things that they're proud of about themselves? Who do they have relationships with? And we talked about some, maybe they don't have a lot of relationships, or maybe those who are working with that individual don't even know about who are those critical relationships that they have that you could tap into. And then this is a really great one, what works and what doesn't work. When we did this, a person-centered planning orientation with our project staff, we had them each pick a frame and do it, and one of our staff did what works and what doesn't work, and it's like one of my favorite things to do, because it really does help the people that you are around on a regular basis to know what you respond positively to and what you don't, what you're going to respond negatively to. So, and that's from an individual perspective. When I've done this planning process where the individual student is not there, maybe they're not high enough functioning or whatever, and it was more like the family members and other support people there doing the planning process around the student, it tends to be like, well, what works when we do it for or trying to address the individual, and then they respond positively or negatively. So it's different whether you're the individual sharing what works for me or not, or whether you're an outside person saying when this occurs, it's a negative response or a positive response. Interesting. And then of course our dreams, fears, barriers, concerns. And of course the goals. So how many of you are familiar with Renew as a process? Okay, so not a lot. So we don't use Renew in Florida right now, but let me get its absolute total name, because it stands, of course it's an acronym because we have to use acronyms. Rehabilitation, Empowerment, Natural Supports, Education, and Work. That's what it stands for. So it's an individualized transition planning. So it's mostly done students in high schools who either have behavioral or maybe mental health kinds of problems. Usually these are students who aren't very engaged in school, having difficulty with either attendance and definitely grades, and just really aren't being very successful in that setting. And but it's very youth driven, right? So that's a very important key. If you think about how successful is a student who we're trying to get them into adulthood, from high school into adulthood, if they're not driving the goals and the motivation isn't being found from within them, they're not going to be bought into that process. But it generates creative opportunities for those students. So the idea is our high schools, our school systems are very much system driven, right? So you must have however many credits to graduate, you must have this many math courses, you must have, and very much the system. And if you don't work in the system, you fail. But the idea for Renew is that what does this individual want? And then how do we build a system, a creative system, to be able to help that individual make that goal happen? And then we just get creative and figure out how to make it happen. And so it takes them out of figuring out how do we help you fit in the system and make you, how do we force you through this system successfully, which is what we've mostly done in education when we're trying to help somebody who's failing the system. How do we help you not fail the system? This takes that whole idea away and says, what do you want and how do we help you get that, right? So it really is a very youth-driven, and the student is in the driver's seat, and that is critical to this. They have to identify their goals, and they decide who's going to be there as part of the planning process. It is their goal. They have to decide who gets to be part of that process. And when I spoke to Melissa about this, she said, yeah, it can be difficult because sometimes they don't want their parent to be part of that process, and that's a hard one. So it's really important for the adults there. They are facilitating the process. They aren't operating. They're not driving. So I think this is a really nice illustration of this is like our worst nightmare, right? Like in the MAPS thing, as an adult doing Renew, our worst nightmare is that the student would see us as trying to control the process. Our goal is facilitating is that the student sees themselves in the driver's seat, and that our nightmare is that they see us as trying to drive the process, right? So they have ideas for how to make sure their facilitators and the participants who go through the process know how to engage. And she did mention that they do this process for Renew, but they do some sort of individualized focus for all students who go through any individualized tier 2 or tier 3, definitely tier 3 intervention. So it may not be this exact process used in Renew, but every student that receives intensive interventions, they have an individualized focus where they try to build relationship and get to know those students. So this is a nice illustration of a completed Renew map. So you can really see the detail. It's very comprehensive, and they get a really nice finished product at the end. I'm not going to be able to show you this video, but this is one that Melissa shared, and it's a wonderful video, and you can look it up, The Power of One Caring Adult. So I strongly encourage you to check out that video sometime, and you will find out the power of just one caring adult, because that's sort of what this process can be for a lot of the students who engage with Renew. And that building that relationship, sometimes it'll be the first time that they've really felt that connection and that a caring adult. So that's our content, but we'd like to be able to open up to some questions then about person-centered planning. And
any questions you have about the process or different processes or things you've used? Those of you that have used person-centered planning, what have you used and what was your reaction to it?
How often do you come back to it? Like after you do this process, then how do we then continue with it?
Yeah, and in many of the processes, that's actually within there. So, for instance, if you've got the PATH process, you'll have a 1 week, a 1 month, a 3 months, all those kind of things. So it's generally set up to be, we're going to meet together weekly, or we're going to meet together monthly, or however that's going to be agreed upon by the team. Okay. It's very seldom it's where you just do it and you forget about it. That's not going to work. So it's, you come back to it, and sometimes you'll have to redo it. You realize, okay, the strategies or what that person wants in their life has changed. So.
another thing that some teams have done is every time that, because they're on this really nice chart paper that's very attractive and interesting to look at, is every time the team gets together to do data reviews and updates and process, they put it on the wall. So it's always there as a reminder of the intention. So it's helpful to kind of keep them on track. So sometimes maybe you do tend to get focused around the data and the behavior and that kind of thing. So it's not that you don't have those meetings anymore, and it's not that you aren't focused on some of those things and those data, but that you don't lose sight of the larger goal that you're also trying to work towards.
Other questions? I share with my staff that years ago, when I came to Florida 20 years ago, before I came, I was in West Virginia, and it wasn't a great work environment. And my staff there came to me and said, we want to do a path with you, for you. And I said, okay. And they went through the path process with me, and during that process, I realized it was time for me to leave. And they knew that already, but they wanted me to see it. And they said, it's okay, we're releasing you, you can go. This is not going to be a place where you can continue to grow. And it was just a very powerful and empowering process. And we had done that for all the staff, but they'd never done it for me. And it was really important to do that. So you had a question?
So obviously you need students' input with this. So what are the challenges with elementary kids that you barely speak, or again process what they're going to do in an hour versus trying to think of the dream? You know what I mean? So what are some of the challenges, how you address with them?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll start and you can jump in here. One of the things that we do is you don't go into the meeting cold. Okay, you don't go in and say, okay, this is person-centered planning, and this is something, and we're going to do 3 hours, we're going to cover all this. With any student or anybody that this is engaged in this process, you want to prepare them ahead of time. So you may engage them in some of those activities. So what are the things you really like, and what are the things you really, so that you can bring out, prompt, remind them. Remember when we met last week and you said, these are the things you really liked? You know, share me what you were thinking about back then. So you're getting the information, it's just coming, you're prompting it, you're supporting it, you're making sure the person feels comfortable with that process. So do that as much as possible. Prepare the people ahead of time for what that meeting's going to be about. Thank you.
Yeah, we actually, in our integrated process, we gave all the team members the frames ahead of time in paper form so they could think through, because it's a lot of information to come up with on the fly, so they could pre-think about what works, what doesn't, what are their hopes, dreams, fears, people, they could think about some of those things. So doing it with the individuals also, but everybody had the opportunity even to think through those things in advance as well.
Over there.
I'm associated on the follow-up with that. Would it be, I have kids like 30 minutes, 3 times a week. And so I was wondering, maybe given those frames on their own first, let them focus on the first session or whatever, and then the next session go over with them. Do you do that kind of process? Is that
Yes, you don't have to do the whole thing at one time. We have some folks that will say, I've got 30 minutes. We're going to try and do 1 frame. We're going to try and do 2 frames. Over a period of time, we've built this now. So yeah, you can adapt it to whatever that situation is that you want to have. As long as food's involved, that's always an underlying feature that has to be there. Yes?
You talked about this process in the context of doing an FBA as well. That shall always be connected to that. And using person-centered planning as part of your assessment process, do you find that you're able to pull out interventions, antecedent interventions that become recommendation as part of your FBA, or identifying motivating operations or something like that that you then recommend in a plan, engage the kid, work with the kid or the family in this way?
Yeah. Generally what happens is you begin to understand the context of certain things, like why did certain behaviors occur? For instance, when we looked at history, it became very obvious for some individuals, well, this is when he lost his hearing, and then here's when the problem behavior occurred, and here's when, the people began to see, there's a function right here that's coming out historically. And that builds that situation. It also builds the asking question about what works and what doesn't work. So that tells me that I'm not going to use those strategies that don't work with that student, but I'm going to integrate some of those that do work with that student. There are also some things that don't go into the functional assessment. So we very seldom do a functional assessment, a behavior intervention plan for making friends. But it can be done, but it's a whole different set of goals that you might be looking at. The functional assessment might be about challenging behavior. But there may be other goals that you'd address in this process that might be about broader quality of life outcomes for that student. Yes?
So wanting the person or the student at the center of the process to be in the driver's seat, how do you as a facilitator approach a situation where you sense that the student, in this case, driving the process is driving us to a place where we see conflict that might be created or perpetuated within our environment? What kinds of facilitation techniques do you use in that kind of case?
Yeah. You want to take that one, or you want me to?
I think it's all, like you said, it's contextual, so I think you'd have to understand what the individual is, what the circumstances are. So I think that's a very difficult question to answer without a specific situation, but so if you have a specific example, I could.
But I think some of the things that realize is it's not going to be a conflict-free process at times. There are going to be conflicts that come up. As I said, the girl who broke up with her boyfriend. You've got folks that come in and they're coming in representing an agency and the agency's goals, and halfway through the process, what the agency wants is not what that person wants. And you just have to confront it directly and openly. And so just, it is difficult. So there's not like a one-size-fits-all, but it's a challenge to begin to address that. Okay. I think our time's up. So there's your ways. I understand nothing about how this process works because I'm an old technophobe. So I don't know how to do any of these things, but you do something with that square to do an evaluation of you scan it. Well, I scanned it. There we go. It's done. Thank you. Thank you all very much.